why don't we make a quick start as we're waiting for the last persons to drift in. Welcome back, and our apologies for very short lunch, but it was a very interesting discussion prior to lunch, so we thought it was really worth continuing that. Welcome to the last panel. Very warm welcome to the panelists and to all of you, and thank you for staying. With the discussion, as we left it before lunch, we were drifting into issues of governance, and this is now the session where we are going to sort of stop and think about how we're going to redo governance 10 years after the crisis and in view of more structural issues that are coming now into play. We know that monetary policy has done a lot, maybe not enough, but it has done a lot, both on the regular side, the conventional side, and the unconventional side. Central banks have had their mandate increase as a result of the financial crisis. We've now we've brought the supervisory and the regulatory part back into central banks as a matter of trend. And the other thing we know, and I think it was very obvious in the previous two sessions, is that there is a lot of uncertainty, and hence why we were interested in addressing this issue directly. And you know, not just uncertainty in the sense of probabilities, but also a lack of knowledge, knowing what the new steady state is going to look like, where we're going to end up. So this is a sort of a point to recognize that the role of central banks is actually changing, has changed, or is changing. And, you know, can we still talk about central banks that are independent? And is it right to talk about central banks that are independent while the mandate is being increased, both the scope and the extensity of the mandate is increased? You know, is it legitimate to be talking about inflation or bias and conservative central bankers in the textbook sense while we are confronted with zero lower bound? And the other thing that we need to ask is, how do we hold our central banks accountable? Is this the way that we do it? Is this sufficient, or does it need to change? And we do want to talk about what is the best way of implementing monetary policy, given the constraints that we've heard about in the previous sessions. How are we going to live with the central bank balance sheet of the order of magnitude we have? Do we need to reduce it? Do we need to expand it? Or do we need to leave it as it is? All these questions, and I will ask my panelists to refer to some of these issues. Let me first introduce them to you. On my left, I have Lex Hoogtijn, who is a professor of economics at the University of Groningen. To his left, Marianne Nessen, who is the head of monetary policy department in the Swedish Central Bank. On my right, Martin Helweg, who is a friend of Bruegel's, and he's the Emeritus Director of the Max Planck Institute. And to his right, Professor Takahashi from the Osaka University, a professor in economics, but also previously the Director General of the Institute for Monetary and Economic Studies in the Bank of Japan. Welcome all. I believe we have some time constraints, so I will ask both Lex and Martin to go first, and given that they have to leave in an hour from now, we will then take questions that are arising from the issues that they will have raised, and then we'll ask Marianne and Professor Takahashi to continue the discussion. So without much further ado, Lex, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for the invitation to this very fascinating conference. It is impossible to do justice to all the topics that you mentioned in a brief introduction, so I will focus on uncertainty, on a topic that you didn't mention explicitly, complexity and inflation targeting. And I will first make a couple of very general remarks, and then we'll focus a bit on the ECB. So first, a couple of general remarks, perhaps stating the obvious, but central banks face an uncertain future and intervene in a complex economy. And Maria already alluded to it. If I say an uncertain future, I indeed mean uncertainty rather than risk. And very briefly, if you take pure risk, that's a situation in which you know all the possible outcomes of a certain action or a decision, but you do not know which one will actually materialize. So flipping a coin is the classic example of that. You have two possibilities, heads or tails, but you don't know which one. The nice thing is that if you have to do with a situation of risk, it's analytically very convenient. You can apply all the techniques and modeling and so on and so forth. In a situation of uncertainty, you do not know all the possible outcomes of a certain action. It's a lack of knowledge. So that's, and that happens to be the actual world that we live in. If you look at risk pure, there are very few policy decisions that can be characterized as pure risk decisions. Complexity, also to define that quickly, that's a situation in which we have many interacting agents who also respond to their environment. And the economy, the financial system, is a complex system, is a complex adaptive system. Taking into account both uncertainty and complexity has a couple of consequences for policy making, and I will restrict myself to two to mention. First of all, the future cannot be predicted in detail. Secondly, it's impossible to collect all relevant information and knowledge at any moment in time, let alone through time. These two consequences, and taking into account complexity and uncertainty, imply, again, a number of things. I will restrict myself to three related things. First of all, a policy cannot be fruitfully, sustainably targeted at specific outcomes. It should more aim at creating the right conditions for a favorable outcome. Second one is to be humble. Don't pretend to know much about the economy, how the economy works. Basically, the main task of economists is to explain how little we can know, and at the same time try to influence that. Third, apply what I would call a principle that comes from medicine ages ago. That is the so-called do no harm principle. You could also say follow robust policies, but I think do no harm captures it's better. And that's still in the medicine oath, first do no harm. An economy, as said, is a complex adaptive system. It has its own adjustment mechanisms. Give them a chance to work. Be not a source of instability yourself. That's basically, if you want to capture it, what the no harm principle means. So that was in a nutshell uncertainty, complexity, and what it means for policy. Then now to the ECB. I must say the original ECB strategy, even I would say during the time of the review, had at least some elements that do justice to the fact that we operate in a complex and uncertain world. The ECB has published many speeches, articles emphasizing that the ECB was not an inflation targeter. The ECB had not a target for inflation, but a definition. There was at the same time a so-called second pillar with a guideline for money growth to create the conditions for price stability in the longer term. The ECB emphasized that it was not just looking at a narrow price concept, but also at broader indicators, not only of price developments, but also all kinds of other developments. The medium-term horizon was emphasized. And it was given, explicitly mentioned also, no or very little weight to all kinds of unobservable concepts, like the natural rate of interest, the equilibrium rate of interest, the output gap, and so-called core inflation. It was emphasized at the time. We have to look at headline inflation, because that's what the people in the economy experience. And core inflation is a unobservable concept. Now, what has happened without, I think, much transparency? The ECB, the past few years in particular, has become an inflation target. And a very narrow, precise one. Not just close to, but under 2%. But if you read the combined speeches of Mario Draghi and Peter Praat in particular, you can read that it is either 1.8 or 1.9. That is what is the target. Already since 2007, just before the crisis, the ECB had stopped publishing a guideline for money growth. With hindsight, it is interesting to look at the graph for money growth since the inception of the ECB. It has almost always been above the 4.5%. It has been explained away for quite some time that something was not very well there. But if I recall correctly, in 2007, M3 was growing by 12%. And just at that moment, the ECB stopped at publishing a guideline for that measure. So it's a very significant, certainly with hindsight, move. And recently, the ECB started to put far more emphasis on core inflation rather than headline inflation. And the result of all this is that if you measure the success of the ECB against its own objective, the 1.8 or 1.9, it has, the past few years, it was shown this morning, being consistently unsuccessful. It has to do with an unsuccessful period of monetary policy according to its own measurement. And the ECB uses the fact that the target that it has self-imposed, and in a very intransparent way, again, is consistently missed as a justification for massive monetary financing of government debts and deficits, for QE in general, and unconventional monetary policies in general. I would submit that the shift of the ECB is a shift away from policies that take into account complexity and uncertainty. I think that inflation targeting, from the perspective of the fact that we know so very little, and that we have to deal with a very complex financial and economic system, where it is simply impossible to do a couple of regressions or take a couple of graphs and then say, well, see, it works or it doesn't work. There are so many different influences. It's very hard to prove or disprove any macro theory at all in the real world. So inflation targeting, a relatively poor strategy, and it's even more so if a narrow measure is targeted very precisely. And that's not a small thing. If you would make a little change in the sense that you would say, okay, given what we know so little, let's have a target, let's say, of between 1 and 3%. I think your policies would have been quite different from what they actually were and what you actually are. So this is not a second-order question. Not only even if you are a targeter. So the difference between a narrow target and a somewhat broader target range is already a very fundamental point, let alone the question of whether you should be an inflation targeter at all. What are the implications or the risks of such an approach? Loss of credibility, not hitting your target for 20 years, for 4 years. In the end, I think cannot be without loss of credibility, loss of effectiveness, loss of an anchor. The creation of bubbles, financial instability, misallocation, fundamental change of working of markets. I think the words that Ulrich used this morning, the decentralized economy, I take that he meant the market economy, what we have seen over the past few years as a result of unconventional policies, is a reduction in market functioning, working of markets. Also, structural, fundamental changes in behavior. To put it a little bit provocatively, before the ECB started to intervene in corporate bond markets, perhaps analysts paid some time to think about the profitability of the corporate sector. Once it was clear that the ECB would start a program, the focus shifts on trying to understand how that program would work, which corporates the ECB would buy and when, moving away from how a market is supposed to work. Locking in low productivity because of the very low interest rates, creating zombie firms and zombie banks. So those are some of the risks. So I conclude by saying that I fully agree with what I think Gregory said this morning for other reasons probably, that an explicit new review of the ECB strategy is very much necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, It's interesting to, you talked about the two-pillar system and how we created a la Bundesbank in the genesis of the ECB. Then we used the two pillars to confuse us in the communication, and then in 2007 we abandoned it precisely for this reason. And then we are coming back to it to say, well, maybe we should have kept it all the way. So one of the things that actually we didn't see during that process, and why I think the second pillar was de-emphasized, is that money growth, high though that was, of the order of magnitudes that you mentioned, it never fed to inflation. So the money growth that we setting at the rates that we had, so the central bank said, well, why are we using this? This was a discussion at the time, and why are we using this pillar when we're not doing anything for it? And actually, I'm not trying to defend it, I'm just saying what the arguments were, and there is also Timbergen. If you have two targets, I mean, we have one instrument. I mean, what are the two necessarily reconcilable? So you have both an inflation target, and by that I mean you have an objective of inflation, and you have an objective of money growth, but you only have the interest rate, and therefore can you do the both? But that's something for. So what needs to happen next? Now, of course, in retrospect, we know that money growth, I mean, asset price growth was extremely important in as feeding into the crisis. So how do we do things differently? Is macroprudential the way forward, or are you advocating for a return to the two-pillar? So that's one question. But before you answer, you gather your thoughts. Martin, can we have your thoughts on this?
Well, I will not talk about these things. I will talk about central bank governance.
Yes. Well, it's related, I think.
And central bank governance, for me, is the question of what do we do with the independence of the central bank. Yeah. The independence of the central bank, in particular of the ECB, has been called into question quite substantially in Germany, of all countries, in the proceedings before the German Constitutional Court. Before I go to that, a few remarks on where does independence come from. It has two sources. One source is that central banks started out as banks, and interference with that requires an understanding of banking, and politicians used to shy away from that, especially at a time when the central bank's liability side actually consisted of liabilities under the gold standard and similar regimes. The other source of central bank independence is an Allied invention imposed on Germany, awful allies, in 1922 and again in 1948 and 51. And the Bundesbank, after 51, engaged in a campaign to enhance its own public standing, with the effect that by 1957, when the Bundesbank law was codified, Adenauer had to retreat from an attempt to do away with the independence of the Bundesbank because of a public outcry. Now, independence has become enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty. I leave it to you whether this was under German pressure or whether it was as a consequence of bad experiences with dependent central banks in the 70s and 80s. I think the two played together. So at the time, everything seemed fine, except we then got this strange experience. Independence was supposed to mean that the ECB had to behave like the Bundesbank. If they don't behave like the Bundesbank, they cannot be independent. So that's basically the gist of public debate in Germany, especially under the auspices of the Bundesbank, which very much plays on German nationalism and must be deemed to be the leading scorer of own goals in public debate. Because much of what they say against the ECB is going to come back to hit them if ever the monetary union is going to be dissolved. Now, the German Constitutional Court has addressed these issues in its Maastricht judgment, where it said, well, it's bad to give away national sovereignty, but this can be done if the transfer is limited, if it's an independent body, and it's all focused on one particular objective. I also wish to mention the Lisbon judgment. Transfers of sovereignty must not go along with any compromising of democratic procedures. So a key question that was raised in both the OMT and the QE cases was, to what extent is what the ECB is doing compatible with democratic procedure? The Constitutional Court also plays on German nationalism. After all, they're in competition with Luxembourg. But much of what they say conforms to traditional constitutional law doctrine in Germany. I've experienced this in connection with competition policy. To what extent is the Federal Cartel Office independent? The constitution lawyers say no. The competition lawyers say yes, and they leave it at that. Now, in the case of OMT and QE, the Constitutional Court has raised two issues. One, all of this amounts to monetary financing of government budgets. Two, imposing risks of losses on taxpayers without parliamentary approval is in violation of democratic procedures. I have very serious issues with this reasoning, which, by the way, is in many ways shared by the Bundesbank. This is why I said they're good at scoring own goals. First, there is no expression of any understanding of the fact that as a central bank holds assets, risks of losses on those assets are unavoidable. See, for instance, the dollar reserves of the Bundesbank in a previous era. There is no understanding of the fact that the central bank's money issue is not debt, because it doesn't oblige the central bank to do anything. And here I share Eric Lonergan's criticism this morning of bad lingo, even among central bankers. Even every money forger knows that if he forges notes, bank notes, and uses them to buy stocks, and afterwards the stock prices go down, on balance, there's been a profit. That argument applies to the German Constitutional Court's concerns about QE. There is a wealth effect. Now, a key issue, and I also believe that the issue of interest on reserves, which has been mentioned this morning, doesn't really do away with that. there's no understanding of the problem of time consistency in the issue of money. I mean, we all know that in normal circumstances, the positive wealth effect to the issuer of money is balanced by a negative wealth effect on holders of outstanding money. And that there's a time consistency problem in issuing money in that today I want to promise that I will not issue more money tomorrow. And if that's been successful at giving me a good value for the money I issue, tomorrow I turn around and say, ha ha, fooled you. That notion that time inconsistency may be a reason for independence has not made it into the doctrine of constitutional law. I just hope that the ECJ will be wiser in that respect. Finally, there is no understanding of the fact that fiscal effects are unavoidable, and that indeed these very fiscal effects, combined with the time inconsistency problem that I mentioned, were the reason why the Allies imposed central bank independence on the Germans in the first place. At a more practical level, if we ask, why do we have this discussion? One is a resurgence of nationalism of German institutions. I suspect that if the Schuman Plan was proposed today, it would be contested in the Constitutional Court. The other, the enormous distributive effects that have become very visible, more visible than they used to be in the past. And the problem is not so much who suffers, but who benefits. All those rotten bankers were bailed out with support from the central bank. That supports populist resentment against this central bank policy. Those profligate Mediterranean governments are being bailed out by the ECB. All of that supports unrest and a sort of deep resentment against the distributive effects of monetary policy. If we think back to the early 90s, Greenspan recapitalizing American banks by having a short rate of 4% and a long rate of 8%, and doing that over 4 years. That was a distributive effect of a large scale, which was basically hidden. The problem we have nowadays is that the distributive effects are so obvious. I would like to draw attention to another aspect of the issue. Money is a source of power, and the question is how to prevent abuse of that power. Trichet's letter to Ireland, the Trichet-Draghi letter to Berlusconi, the Greek freeze were all measures of interference with democratic decision-making in different countries, using the power of the central bank over the money supply and over the banking system. In the case of Ireland, the threat; in the case of Greece, the actuality of a breakdown of the national payment system in order to exercise influence on democratically elected governments in the interests of creditors, one of whom the ECB was itself. I see a very serious problem in that potential for abuse inherent in the power of the central bank over banking systems and over payment systems. And in that respect, independence under the Maastricht Treaty is much stronger than independence under national law, because under national law, the government and parliament are always in a position to threaten, we can do away with that. We just abolish independence. I'm sure if the Swedish central bank tried to do anything like blackmailing the Swedish government whatever independence it has now would quickly disappear. With the ECB, that's not possible because we require unanimous approval to change the regime. So what controls can we have? The judiciary? Well, that requires people who are affected to have standing in the ECJ, which they do not have. The executive or the legislature, the finance minister that everybody is talking about, or the Eurogroup. In the back of this, we have the problem of the split between creditor states and debtor states. And we also have the alternative model, the Eurogroup, or either the Commission or finance minister. One question that one might raise in this context is, why do we actually still have national central banks? I know the historical and political reasons, of course, but they contribute to putting distributive conflicts along national lines into the ECB Council and contribute to the politicization that we have there. I don't have an answer to these questions, but I do think that unless we get to a point where the ECB's power to blackmail member state governments through the pressures that it can exert on the banking system and the payment systems, unless we manage to control that, the system will not be sustainable.
Very much. Thank you very much, Martin. So if I understand you correctly, the summary is that the reasons why we delegated central bank independence in the first place still hold, but there are pockets, possibilities of abuse, especially at the euro area architecture, which is an incomplete architecture. Right? Okay, so as I said, I think we need to open up the floor for discussion now Marianne.
Sorry, Maria,
Sure.
because the last third of my prepared notes are actually addressing what you just raised. So could I just take a few minutes? It won't take more
Of course,
than 2
yes,
or
of
3.
course.
Okay.
I mean, for the sake of
okay, so because
yeah.
otherwise those remarks will be totally uninteresting.
Okay. Oh, I'm sure that's not true.
All right, okay, but let me start from the beginning nonetheless, and just a word of thanks to the organizers for this invitation. It's my first time at Bruegel, and I hope it's not the last. And I work at the Central Bank of Sweden. I'm no longer head of the Monetary Policy Department. I was head there for 5 years. I'm now senior advisor to the executive board of the Swedish Central Banks. But I must say to you that the views presented by me today do not necessarily coincide with those of the executive board. So let me skip then to what I had intended to finish off my remarks with, and it addresses what you brought up on uncertainty and how it's handled in inflation targeting regimes. And I come from a central bank that has had an inflation target for almost 25 years now. We began in 1993. And from my experience, I think it's useful to keep separate the general framework of inflation targeting on one hand, and how, on the other hand, on how it's been operationalized in many places, among them at my own central bank. And I think that some people like to present inflation targeting more of a science than it is. Actually, it is. It's a lot of judgment too. And while the general framework is very, very good, and I think we should keep it, namely having an explicit goal for inflation, perhaps 2%, having an explicit goal because this is a focal point of expectations. I think we need to work a little bit more on other areas, and I think it has a lot to do with communication. And I think we as central bankers should be mindful of not giving the appearance that we can fine-tune the economy. I think we are all guilty of making that mistake. So less appearance of fine-tuning. And then more and more emphasis perhaps on uncertainty. Now, I would like to just propose that I think here we may need to make a distinction between how uncertainty is taken into consideration in policy making and in when the decisions are made. And on the other hand, when the decisions are communicated. My experience tells me that this can be quite different. I mean, when you're in the room with a group of policymakers, I think uncertainty is on top of their minds, or regardless of what the material that has been presented to them by the staff, uncertainty regarding the staff's results, etc., is on the top of their minds. However, when we go out and communicate the decisions, we have to be very clear. We have to be very clear, and some would say we have to be very simple. I don't know. So I think we should. So it's difficult to communicate about uncertainty, and central bankers are not the only people who have a hard time communicating about the future and uncertainty about the future. I mean, take for example weather forecasters. I mean, these people know everything about uncertainty, but what they present to us, when I look in my app, it says 17 degrees. It doesn't say a range. So that's their communication. So we're not the only people who are poor at communicating uncertainty. So and I think there is also a modeling culture in central banks that we like to put numbers to everything, and perhaps also to phenomena which cannot be quantified. So I realize there is a modeling challenge there. The challenge is to convey the idea of uncertainty without sending a message of sort of not having a clue, because that in the end can also affect our credibility. So that was what I wanted to say on that topic.
Thank you very much. That's actually very relevant. I do have questions, but I think I should let first the public and our panelists to respond to that. Why don't we collect some questions and then we'll come back to the panel. Which direction do we need to go now? We start with the middle, I think, Andre. I wasn't sure which direction we need to follow this time. Andre, and we go this way.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question to Martin. You made very forcefully the point that the redistributive effect of monetary policy is inherent to monetary policy, and you have made that point before, and I remember we had those discussions, and I think that at one level or many levels that's obviously right. Now, what I wonder is that in relationship to the discussion that you had, with the German Constitutional Court and the ECJ, I wonder to what extent that is also true in a political sense for the ECB, and to what extent there is not an impossible situation for the ECB to be. After all, the ECB is not the central bank of a political union. The ECB is the central bank of a monetary union. And so when you make the parallel with the savings and loan situation in the US in the 1990s, the 4%, yes, I mean, that is correct, but the United States is the United States of America, and the Fed is, as it says on the website of the Federal Reserve, the Fed is a branch of government in a sense. Now, the ECB is not a branch of government in Europe. We do not have a government, so we don't have a political union. So I wonder, to what extent, even though obviously you're very right that it's inherent to monetary policy that there is redistribution, to what extent that inherent fact need not be nonetheless be applied in a manner which is very prudent because of the nature of the monetary union, which is not a political union.
Stavros?
I mean, first a quick comment for Marianne. It was a good analogy with the weather forecasters. except they don't have to make policy how to fix the weather.
Yes.
Which brings me to the comment to Martin, which I thought was a brilliant, kind of forceful exposition. I'm coming from a southern country. I'm from Cyprus. And I don't have so much a problem with what you articulated, which is correct, like the ECB is acting as an enforcer. But I have a problem when an ECB follows policies that do not work, and then there is no accountability. So I would like you to address a little bit the issue of accountability. Let's take the simple thing, the price stability. They're supposed to deliver certain inflation. They are not. How are they accountable? And to go a little bit to the issues you were discussing, if it will help your portfolio of examples, Cyprus built a huge exposure to the Greek sovereign debt because of ECB policy of carry trade. Right? In the Acharaya paper on carry trade, Cyprus has the top of the list for carry trade. And then when it was time for the chickens to roost, the ECB acted as an enforcer for solving the mistakes that was partly ECB mistakes for allowing this carry trade to take place. So I would like to know this issue of accountability, how to hold them accountable when their policies fail.
Thank
Whether
you very much,
forecasters go home and they just told us what the weather will be like.
Yeah. So, Eric?
I guess this question is partly inspired by what Martin was saying, but I'm very interested to get all of the panelists' thoughts on it. There's something which I like to call the Bundesbank fallacy, which is to confuse an effect with a policy. So, for example, if we all collectively decide to go to the restaurant across the road for dinner, that will absolutely have a fiscal effect. To call it a fiscal policy would be to challenge the independence of the English language, right? It's not fiscal policy, but it has a fiscal effect. And in fact, I think this fallacy is repeated by economists virtually any time we have a discussion on this matter, which is worth being alert to. So my question is, if you were not an economist and you know that one of the central issues of central banking legitimacy in the Eurozone is the issue of what is fiscal and what is monetary policy, you would assume the delineation will be well defined in any economic textbook. I challenge you to find a single economic textbook that is ruthlessly clear on what is fiscal and what is monetary. And I'm tempted to challenge the panel, if anyone's willing to give me a robust abstract definition. I think there is a very clear one provided by Milton Friedman. But because I'm Irish, I'll only share that over a pint of Guinness.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Ulrich? Yeah.
No, just on what Mr. Helwig has been saying on the blackmailing by the ECB of different people or governments. So on the payment system, and you mentioned the Greek payment system, I think there was never, a blackmailing that led to a shutdown of the Greek payment system. I mean, there may have been liquidity constraints eventually hitting the Greek banking system in view of, let's say, structural large capital outflows from Greece in the context of the policies of the Greek government at that time. And I think the need then to impose capital controls by the Greek government followed from those very long-lasting and massive capital outflows that were triggered by the government of Greece. And you could say, the central bank has no constraint. It could close any liquidity gap. But the central bank has constraints. No, it has legal constraints. It has, to act in accordance to, I would say, logic and its legal mandate. And here, I would say there were reasons why the central bank, the euro system, was not the unlimited liquidity source for those large-scale capital outflows for various reasons. So that I would say I would not see at all here the blackmailing by the ECB if the Greek government had to act against the capital outflows, the very large ones that it had itself triggered by imposing capital constraints at the end. Thank you.
Then Athanasios.
Yes, coming back to the question of governance, there was a very lovely essay that Guido Tabellini, who many of us know, wrote a few years ago, in which he talks about the different forms of accountability of public organizations. He argues that either there can be political accountability, which is to the voters, or else regulatory accountability, by which he means that the organization operates within an ambit of a set of rules that were initially established at political level and then has accountability to the courts. It seems pretty clear, I think, especially from Dr. Helwig's very, very lovely remarks, that political accountability would be the wrong model here for ECB. But then with the regulatory accountability, it doesn't seem to really function in this case for reasons that I think you sketched out. You don't have rights as a plaintiff and so on. Are there ways that the regulatory accountability, I think this comes back to your question, who could do it, how could it be done? One very quick question, thought about Ms. Nessen's comments. Often when I'm trying to express policy goals in uncertainty, I express things in sort of a bracket of expected outcome, lowest expected, highest expected. But of course, it's really always a confidence interval, and you could be outside the bounds too. But does that actually help narrow the gap a bit, perhaps? Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to combine the three interventions to try to have the divergence of Lex on one hand saying we should not be very specific with the goals. Marianne pointing out the communication of an uncertainty, and Martin wondering, well then, how do we make sure that an independent institution works? And combining all of this, I think it's actually very important to realize that along the lines of the comment that was just made, if we want to defend the independence of a non-elected technocratic institution, then we must be confident that that institution sticks to rules. When it comes to the definition of price stability, for example, I think it's dead wrong to allow the ECB to define and change the definition of price stability at will. If the ECB happens to be captured by some member states, then we're going to have cyclical definitions of price stability. For example, if Germany has undue leverage on the ECB, then we may see inflation slightly over 2% when the German economy needs additional expansion, and way below 2% when the German economy is overheated, which just happens to match the data in the last 20 years. So this is the sort of concern that would be solved if we had an exact rule. 2% inflation is your goal, hit it. In terms of the uncertainty, this would be communicated by realizing that inflation targeting is a very robust framework that depends on forecasts. So we could actually hold the ECB accountable to provide us inflation forecasts that hit that 2%, recognizing that there is uncertainty in the goals you have to deliver. So I would say, and this is a question for Martin, whether this would be a way towards resolving the tension. First, I have to say that I fully agree with you that the current framework is unsustainable. If we take into account the ECB actions in the last, well, since the crisis began really, I think it has used its discretion in ways that were not envisaged when the treaty endowed the ECB with this independence, overly expanding into deeply political decisions. This is why I challenged Ulrich with Ottmar Issing's question, if there is something flawed with what the governments are doing, is it the ECB's job to interfere or not? And the answer clearly should be not. However, the ECB has been doing that. So could we resolve this by narrowing the discretion the ECB has and really demanding that the ECB stick to the rules, and the flexibility should be designed in a manner that is ex ante fiscally neutral, rather than have the ECB Governing Council on a case-by-case basis decide what its policies are going to be towards banks, for example, and take different decisions when German banks are in trouble or Dutch banks are in trouble vis-a-vis Irish banks. We should have ex ante rules that cannot be violated. Would this be a solution to the problem? If it is a solution, we still need a change of the treaty in order to enforce it, because with the current treaty, the ECB has way too much discretion.
Yeah, let me start out by your two questions that you raised at the beginning. You said there was no inflation. At least that was the official explanation in the run-up to the crisis. But there was, of course, inflation. There was asset price inflation. House prices went up very strongly. So there was inflation. That's exactly my problem. If you define inflation in such a way that where the action is, you leave that out, then then there is no inflation. Then and at the moment, I would say we are making exactly the same mistake. There is asset price inflation going on. Just one example: in the Netherlands, housing prices are increasing by 8% on average. Again, already for 2 years in a row. Then you could say, well, what we have learned is that we need macroprudential policies. That's true, but I'm quite disappointed by the use of those policies because I don't see them applied. For instance, in the case that I just mentioned. I think the remark on the weather forecast, I think, has been already taken care of in a way. I think there is a difference between trying to target a price level and trying to forecast the weather. Perhaps now that we try to tackle global warming, we may be moving in that direction also in terms of climate. But I have the same reservations of policies in that area that I have with monetary policy. Does that mean that you have to communicate that you have no clue? No, I don't think so. You have to not set targets which you can unlikely sustainably achieve. So that again, that means that what you have under control, you should be accountable for what you have under control. That's the general rule, and not for something that you cannot control in a sustainable way. And that's also my problem with Athanasios' proposal to even put in law a very precise figure, which you cannot assume the central bank to be able to deliver in a sustainable way. And that's exactly the kind of overconfidence that I refer to this morning. So inflation targeting in general is creating an overconfidence that you think you have in knowing exactly what you need to do to achieve exactly your 2% target in this case. A few words only on the independence. I think all those who have spoken agree on the fact that there are problems in the treaty, and I agree. But I have another problem than the ones mentioned so far, and that is that there in the treaty there are a couple of very clear rules. There is this question, but there are also a couple of very clear rules, which, for instance, make that I don't have to make a distinction between what is exactly fiscal and what is exactly monetary. I think one of the core principles, and you may disagree with it, but one of the core principles underlying the treaty was no monetary financing of government debt and deficits. Now, what is actually happening is massive monetary financing. Still, we have a framework that doesn't allow us to legally. It is, as far as I understand it, it cannot be seen as massive monetary financing, which it is. In my own country, in the meantime, the central bank has almost a third of the whole government debt on its balance sheet. if that is not monetary financing, somebody has to explain to me what Article 1, 2, 3, but what's the restriction coming from Article 1, 2, 3? And I think that's very difficult to say. So I'm all in favor of strict rules, but there is a difficulty that you cannot in advance define all the contingencies. And you have moved away far from what were the principles in underlying the Maastricht Treaty. I fully agree with Eric in that sense. And that undermines the requirements for independence. Well, independence requires that you have a limited mandate, clear rules to be followed, and the ends, price stability, does not, that was the intention at least, justify all the means.
Thank you very much. Because we have to rush out.
Okay, first, Eric, anything has fiscal effects. How to separate the two? I think I hope I've made clear that I don't share the argument of the Bundesbank or the German Constitutional Court. I do believe that this is possible, and that one can say something is primarily monetary policy. And I think that the ECJ has done a fairly good job on that. But it's worth keeping this conflict in mind because it reflects some of the problems that people have in this context. Ulrich bin said, the pensioner who couldn't draw the money from his pension thought that there was a problem about the payment system. And at least indirectly, that problem had been triggered by the freeze of emergency liquidity assistance. What if the ECB follows policies that do not work? Well, we need to discuss that. I mean, this morning we had a lot of discussion. I don't think it was unanimous in this, and in the sense that we could use that as a basis for saying, and now we've got to impose this on the ECB. I actually disagree with much of quantitative easing, but I think quantitative easing, from my perspective, is well within their mandate, and this is something where one has to engage in political discussion. I do think, for the reasons that I indicated, namely time inconsistency, that independence is important. Yep. And the problem is, André, that the other side, the sort of dirty side of central banking, comes with it anyway and cannot be separated. By the way, in 1990 in the US, it wasn't the S&Ls, it was the commercial banks. It's basically like the macroeconomists look at the ECB or the central bank and monetary policy as one looks at the smiling face of a baby in a family album. And one never sees in the family album the pictures of diapers being changed. Transactions of the ECB with the financial sector are of the diapers nature. And the problem is that much of that has come up in the crisis and has become very political in the crisis. I very much believe that we need to have rules for that, we need to have accountability, but we shouldn't just think about writing those rules. We should also think in terms of procedure. And in terms of procedure, one aspect is the composition of the council. Another aspect is what kind of intervention if rules are violated? Who has access to what instance to make sure that those rules are being imposed? What formal means or informal threats are there to induce rule compliance? That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you both very much for your intervention. I know you have to leave in a minute, so stay till you can't stay no more. But then perhaps I could go back to Marianne, if you could start from the beginning now on your story. Thank you.
Okay, and before I go back to the beginning, let me just finish off this comparison with the weather forecasts. And now, of course, I realize there is a problem there because weather forecasts that they don't target beautiful weather, but central banks have, and so we publish our inflation forecasts, and of course, and for natural reasons, they always go to the target, which is not. We're often criticized for that in the central bank community, but I think it's very obvious that with appropriate policy, inflation will somewhere in the future go to target. So all our inflation forecasts go to 2, somewhere along the line. Okay. Now, the remainder of my topics, I have a couple of different themes. I will, in a little while, talk about some reviews that are being made of central bank mandates. I mean, the financial crisis has led to a renewed interest in discussing central bank independence and mandates and forms of accountability. So I will, in a little while, talk about 2 reviews currently underway, one in Norway and one in Sweden, in my country. Another theme that I will talk a little bit about is operationalization, or putting things into practice, because it's not always easy to translate recommendations from research or from legislation into practice. The devil is in the details, and this is something that has become very apparent during and after the financial crisis. So I'll give you some example of that, and this has relevance for aspects of central bank governance. And now just some general words. I mean, in my perspective, the monetary policy landscape has changed dramatically now. It's very different compared to before the financial crisis. And before the financial crisis, I think there was a sort of consensus on the mandate of the central bank and what type of analysis was required. And the type of analysis that was required was, I think, very nicely summarized by Esther Faya this morning. So there was a strong presumption that that was the way the world worked, and we didn't need to look at anything else. Now, to put it mildly, we have much more multifaceted views, and it's on a range of issues, from our understanding of the transmission mechanism, and we now understand that our understanding is very incomplete. Our understanding of what monetary policy is, and how do we draw the line to other policy areas. We talked a lot about fiscal. I would like to talk more about macroprudential and financial stability policies. So our understanding of that has changed. And again, the connection between monetary policy, monetary stability, price stability, and financial stability. We recognize there are connections, but what those connections look like in detail is far from understood. So that's why it's so good that we have these types of discussions. So there's a lot of rethinking going on in academia, among policymakers, and by legislators. And this is a good thing. It's a natural thing. It's a consequence of the financial crisis. Now, before talking about the reviews that are being made, let me just some personal thoughts. I hope that the current reassessments in the academic community, among policymakers, etc., I hope that one outcome of this is that we will be able to lock in what has been achieved in the past decades in terms of getting inflation down to low and stable levels. And I think this focus on price stability has indeed been a very, very good one. So let us be careful there. Let us not change things too much. On the other hand, and this is the difficult challenge, we have to recognize that monetary policy is not as easily defined as we previously thought. and we cannot easily separate it from other areas, financial stability in one. And another challenge going on, and which has been touched upon during today's discussions, is that we have an environment, an external environment, which is changing rapidly. One, of course, we have the secular fall in long-term interest rates. You can call that a falling, you can couch that in terms of the natural rate falling. You don't have to talk about that. You can just look at graphs of long-term real interest rates and see that they're trending down. And we've talked a lot about what this means for central banks. And another change is technological advances, which is changing our payment systems rapidly. So that is something that I think that will have to be looked at when legislators look at central bank mandates going forward. Okay, so let me now talk about the reviews underway in Norway and Sweden. I think this may be of interest to a bigger audience. I'll start with Norway, and just first a reminder, as you all know, Norway is not a member of the EU, so they can do things the way they want to do things. And by EU standards, the Norwegian central bank is not very independent. It sort of reports directly to the Ministry of Finance. It's different in Sweden. I'll get to Sweden soon. The Norwegian central bank, they've had an explicit inflation target since the early 2000s, and that target is set by the government. And this past June, a commission chaired by a former governor of the Norwegian central bank, they published a proposal for a new act for the Norwegian central bank. Their old legislation was rather old, a couple of decades. And some highlights. First of all, they propose a separation of their government pension fund from the central bank. That pension fund now amounts to many times Norwegian GDP, and I can imagine what type of management attention that requires. So the Commission is proposing breaking the pension fund out of the central bank. More interesting, perhaps, for this discussion is that the objectives of the central banks are proposed to be: 1, monetary stability; 2, financial stability on an equal footing. And subject to that, they can look at employment, output gaps, etc. They also propose a new internal governance structure. So that was the Norwegian review underway. It's been put out for public commentary, and will it become a law? We don't know. The earliest possible is early 2019.
Is also the part of the change the macroprudential side? I mean, is part of this change also giving the tools to the bank?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Actually, that's important because right now the Norwegian central bank, they are asked to or required to give recommendations to the government, because that's where the responsibility lies now. But in this new proposal, that will be transferred to the central bank. Okay. Now, Sweden, the review underway in my home country. Now, Sweden is a member of the EU, but has its own currency. And we have had an inflation target since 1993. So next year, we'll be celebrating a quarter of a century with an inflation target. A parliamentary investigation was established in late last year. A parliamentary committee, and that investigation is expected to be finished in about 2 years, or in 2019. And according to the terms of reference in that investigations, there are a number of topics that are to be addressed. One is the monetary policy mandate. Who should set it? What should the definition be? Another topic is the Riksbank's responsibility for financial stability, but with an important caveat. macroprudential responsibilities and tools lie with the FSA in Sweden. That was decided a number of years ago by the government. That is not to be. That is going to continue to be that. Nonetheless, the committee is going to look at Riksbank responsibility for financial stability. Another topic is the organization of the Riksbank. For example, today we have a 6-member executive board. And with such a small central bank, having 6 bosses can be a challenge. But for other reasons, they are going to look at if they're going to have the setup of the Bank of England, where you have an MPC, and perhaps with external members, but that is separate from the executive board. The executive board runs the bank. Okay. They're also going to look at accountability and the democratic control of the Riksbank, and they're also going to look deeply into questions that pertain to payment systems questions. Sweden is a country where endogenously we are getting rid of cash. It's not a decision made by any authority. People do not want to hold cash anymore. So we're quietly and quickly becoming a cashless society, and this brings it with a host of really interesting policy questions. Now, so that was the Swedish review. Now, I'd like to make some observations here. And as I said, the Norwegian central bank is less independent than the Riksbank, and this has interesting consequences. First, on who is or has been doing the reviews. In the Norwegian case, with a dependent central bank, it's a number of experts who have done who've conducted the survey. In the Swedish case, with a very independent central bank, it's the politicians doing the review. I think that's interesting. Exactly. So I'm coming to that. And the mandate that the Norwegian Commission is proposing is a very broad one. As I mentioned, financial stability on equal footing with monetary and price stability. In Sweden, we don't know what the new mandate will be, but the one that we have is more narrow. It's price stability, and the issue and the question of giving the central bank a financial stability mandate in Sweden is very, very controversial. So there is this interesting aspect that with a more independent central bank, you will have a more a less wide mandate, so to speak. And all of that is fine. I think it follows from principles of delegation to an independent authority. But the problem, as I've alluded to many times already, is that monetary policy and financial stability are intertwined in ways that were not fully appreciated 20 years ago, but should be more understood now that we've passed the 10-year mark of the financial crisis. Now. Okay, so as mandates are being broadened, governance is coming. Governance and organizational issues are rising, and I'd like to finish up with a comment on the internal organization of a central bank. I think this is not a topic that is often given much attention in academic circles, but I think it is important. And as I mentioned, there are proposals of having an MPC that would take monetary policy decisions and having an executive board that runs, so to speak, runs the central bank. But that type of division, and this is in operation at the Bank of England, but it hinges on the assumption that monetary policy tools are clearly defined. And I would say that they are not. I mean, interest rates, fine, that's a monetary policy rule. But what about all the infrastructure surrounding the market operations? And I'm sorry that Ulrich had to leave. All the infrastructure. For example, the question of counterparties. What institutions have direct access to central banks? This is important. This has implications for how monetary policy is transmitted to the financial sector and therefore also to the rest of the economy. Another issue, collateral policies. What should the central bank accept as collateral? Huge implications for how policy is, at times, huge implications for how policy is transmitted. And these types of questions do not typically lie with an MPC. They lie with the management of the bank. Let me give two examples. The Federal Reserve, many of the facilities launched in 2008 and 2009, they were not decided by or voted on by the FOMC. They were under the jurisdiction of the Board of Governors. That's changed now. Similarly, the Bank of England, there the details of the funding for lending scheme was not decided by or discussed in the MPC. It was decided by the management of the bank. So this is an example of how the interconnection between monetary policy and other aspects will affect the organization of the central bank. Now, one final comment on the effects of the financial crisis. I think we have much more attention now, management attention at central banks devoted to operational issues. The Bank of England, they introduced a third deputy governor in charge of operational issues. At the Riksbank, we've reorganized our department, reintroducing a markets department, which 5 years earlier had been disbanded and sort of put into the monetary policy department and into the financial stability department. We put that together a couple of years ago again. So, okay, that ends my comments.
If you have time, let's have the last presentation, then we can open up the floor for discussion. Yeah, can we have the slides, please, for the last presentation?
Okay, let me give you last and the least presentation. Actually, the title of my talk is about central bank independence. A little bit general and a bit. I try to remind all of you to just a bit old-fashioned central bank independence discussion today. Okay, motivation. Actually, that independence was globally established in the 1990s, in the late 1990s. At the time that we are moving to the right direction, because the reason is simple. Central bank is in the market, and its independence represented kind of the exclusion of the politics from the market economy. But independence is challenged. In the case of the Bank of Japan, we had a new law in 1998. Then we started the challenge. Actually, it started. Actually, that we are challenged more than 20 years, and also the other major central bank that independence challenge. Actually, that after the global financial crisis, in economics, actually simple theoretical justification in economics in the 1990s, it's become nonsense. Actually, in the current situation. So we need to reconsider and the reconstruction of the central independence under the current circumstances. What is the new environment? Actually, apparently that the first one is the most important, and change of the situation of the price from inflation to deflation. And the second one is unconventional monetary policy. And also that we had a new challenge like financial stability. Central bank now, the assignment of the financial stability, and also that fiscal dominance. Okay, that it is another task for central bank to public debt management. And also the politics has changed. The government is more active to intervene in the market, and the politics has deteriorated, like widespread populism. So in general, economy is now a bit politicized. Let me make a brief review about central bank independence in the 1990s. It is very simple. The main main purpose is to control inflation. So it's a conservative central bank approach and delegated monetary policy to conservative central bank and required accountability for the central bank independence. And together with the CPI independence, fiscal discipline was established like EU, like Maastricht, and also the UK. But this theory, then the 1990s, to me, it's very too simple. And so logic is very simple because in the case of inflation, so delegated monetary policy to conservative central bank. That's only logic, I believe. But in the case of the deflation, if so, we don't need any kind of the central bank independence. We don't need to control the inflation. I skipped that one. This is a simple illustration of the, like a log of type of the conservative central bank model. So I tried to pick up that some change of the circumstance. The deflation is the most important one. And the point is it's not temporal. It's prevailing under the secular stagnation. By the declining of the natural rate, we are confronted so-called zero-bound interest rate. And as an alternative, central bank adopted the unconventional monetary policy. But the effect of the quantitative easing is not like on prices, inflation, and real economic activity like output gap is very, very ambiguous. So we couldn't establish so kind of the Taylor rule type of the policy rule about the quantitative easing. So on that reason that the operation of the quantitative easing essentially become very discretionary. Therefore, this discretionality invited the political pressure. Okay. And also that violating that kind of the monetary policy discipline, we invited the fiscal expansion. So losing the monetary policy discipline invited the losing the fiscal fiscal expansion. The other problem of the unconventional monetary policy is its policy effect is very, very asymmetric. It's a relatively weak effect on the real economic activity, like output, but more clear effect on the asset inflation, like stock prices, which invited political pressure. Therefore, that the monetary policy now become manipulated by the politician. The other point is inequality. Inequality was widened by asset inflation. It frustrating that the middle class people, which supposed to support the sound democracy. So my argument is unconventional monetary policy causing so much problem, not only the economic, but also the politics. And the other point is the fiscal dominance. Okay? And now fiscal dominance becomes the top issue for central bank. And monetary policy fall into fiscal dominance and require low interest rate, so-called to support the fiscal sustainability. Now fiscal theory of the price level is highlighted again, but the current argument of this one is, to me, it's very, very misleading. Originally, FTPL showed that the fiscal discipline is a necessity condition for central bank independence and control inflation. But after the fiscal expansion, monetary policy become obedient to the fiscal policy. So now the argument like this one, instead of the monetary policy, fiscal expansion is required to create inflation. It is this type of the discussion is quite misleading, I think that. And also the reassignment of the financial stability. I don't need so much about that. Now that one separate function returned to central bank, but such a policy are conceived fiscal, and which couldn't be independent from the democratic political process. So this caused another big problem for the central bank independence. Also, the increase in political pressure. In the Japanese case, and politicians recognize they have the fatal power on the central bank, so they asked the central bank to making a pressure like a nomination of the board member, also sometimes that giving a pressure on the amendment of the central bank law. This is the case in Japan. So this is my idea, not a brilliant idea, I must say, but first one is how restore the central bank independence. First approach is that separation power approach. This is a bit constitutional approach, I say, and but I need some footnote on this one. And central bank independence is also that the independence within the government. Okay, that within the government we have a same institution like a judicial court, and the US SEC, and the public broadcasting houses. And my argument about separation power approach is more general theory. It could apply to the whatever economic situation, even the inflation or deflation. And this approach was also the political economic approach. And its rationale is a bit difficult, but I said that against the myopic political view, central bank should conduct policy on long-term and non-political perspective. But even so, even non-political, I must say that the central bank shouldn't be silent for politics. Central bank should be active as an independent agency within the government. And also that, central bank independence is a very, very difficult character because it has an aspect of the anti-democracy. In that reason, strongly needed the transparency and accountability. Let me talk about the Japanese constitution or constitutional framework general. I think the constitution has two principles. One is democracy, and one is the separation of power. These two principles is not always very consistent, you know. And my argument is the central bank has a character of the anti-democracy. Famous phrase by the Fed Chairman Martin, take away the punch bowl in the middle of the party. This represents the kind of the anti-democracy character of the central bank. Okay. The other idea of the restore the central bank independence is that adoption of the negative interest rate. By adopting that negative interest rate, we could return to rule-based policy. So, if we return to the rule-based policy, we can have a kind of the independence. That's my idea. So, Kimbo Miles is not here, but he also proposed this kind of the, and also other academics like Marvin Goodfriend and Boiter proposed this one. And as Miles presented in this morning, and he said that he proposed to central bank to issuing that electronic money, but I think that if Miles is here, I'd like to ask him to, there is a lot of the possibility of the private sector now issuing that kind of the electronic money like Bitcash or such one. So the Bitcoin, so So there would be some kind of a competition between the central bank e-money and the private money. So we need to further study on this issue. I will skip the Japan's case, but Japan started a very unfortunate position. So our independence is a more difficult situation, even compared to the other major countries. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for this, and I think we have a little bit of time to sort of engage also with the panelists. If I may first pose a question, Marianne, I thought your intervention was very, very interesting, and I'm delighted actually to hear that there is a process of review going in the Scandinavian, if I may say, countries, inside the EU or outside of the EU. I think it's very fair to do such a process, in particularly after sort of a very, very distortionary crisis that we had in the past 10 years. I think it's very legitimate for the citizen to ask for something to happen. And I guess, again, the Scandinavian countries are really leading with example on how to sort of hold our institutions accountable to their mandates and to their people. If I may ask a question on the first part of intervention, which was the last part originally in your presentation, on the issue of uncertainty. And here I think the issue of how do you apply monetary policy in conditions of the lack of knowledge. We don't know what's going to happen, and we have models. We fit them into data, but the data aren't always a very good predictor of the future, in particular if you believe that we are in a state of fundamental lack of knowledge, which is actually where we are right now. We don't know whether we are in a state of secular stagnation. We simply don't know. So how do you carry out monetary policy here? Here, let me use some of the words that Athanasios used this morning, and if I misuse the context in which you said these things, please correct me. But he argued this morning for sort of, we need to do more. And that resonated to me with a lot what the literature on robust control had said. So when you have fundamental uncertainty, then you do more because that's a way of learning. You find out of what works and what doesn't work. And central bankers have been very, very reluctant to accept these types of policies because they don't consider the economy their own experiment. However, the fact of the matter is we do have huge uncertainty, and then, if you do a little bit and nothing happens, maybe you need to do more, as indeed Athanasios was arguing this morning. But that's one way of thinking about it. There are other ways of thinking about what to do when you sort of don't know, when the underlying distributions are not very reliable, when your tools are failing you, when the models that you have are not sort of well fitted to what you think might be relevant in the future. But how do you go about? Do you agree with Athanasios that we just do more of what we know, or how do you communicate the unknown? What are concrete steps that monetary policy can do in an era of heightened uncertainty? But before you answer, why don't we take a few questions also from the floor, and then we can come back to the panelists. Athanasios.
So I have a very specific question for Marianne, and then a question I would like to ask of all four panelists, and at least maybe two will respond. So the question for Marianne, you mentioned something that I found intriguing. This used to be asked as a question: what is a monetary policy decision and what isn't a monetary policy decision? And I think what we've learned during the crisis is that so many things that were not considered monetary policy decisions before actually are an integral aspect of monetary policy. So they need to be taken by the Monetary Policy Committee because they interact with other things. This goes back in the history of the Fed, the discount rate versus the overnight rate, what's monetary, what's not monetary, and then they kind of got it fixed, as you correctly pointed out, during the crisis. Even on things where legally the Board of Governors was responsible to take decisions, because of the interlinkages with the monetary policy transmission mechanism, the Board of Governors would take decision in the US and during the crisis only after having a thorough discussion with the FOMC so that they could internalize the discussion. Extremely narrow question is with e-money. What's your view on whether the Riksbank, as a specific example, should allow all of us to have an account directly with the central bank, which is a governance and implementation issues? And is this something that the Monetary Policy Committee should decide, or is this something that the Executive Board should decide? On the common questions, first something specific for what are. I don't think QE needs to be discretionary as you described it. I think that's plain wrong. This is like saying interest rates can be a discretionary policy and decision, or they can be a rule-based policy and decision. Much like we can have a Taylor rule that the central bank designs for setting interest rates, we can actually have very specific rules on quantitative easing. It's true, central banks that have decided to do QE decided to do it in a discretionary fashion, but that's their mistake. This is because we did not actually tell the central banks that they should be more systematic in what they are doing. I don't think it's the fact that it's unconventional monetary policy. I think it's always rules versus discretion, and the fact that some central bankers always want to have residual discretion, no matter how they describe this. But the issue I have with the governance of the central bank is the description of interpreting correctly central bank independence, and this is where I would have liked all panelists to respond. How should we think about the functioning of a central bank in a democratic society? Should we think of the central bank as being given a goal, for example, 2% target, and just focusing on that goal as a primary mandate? Or should we say, no, as you seem to have suggested, we should put the central bank inside government. We want the central bank to be involved in politics and so forth. This actually has me worried. Let me give you two quotes from the 1990s, which I think is bad central banking on the case of the BOJ. This is Bank of Japan ECB, so I will give you two Bank of Japan quotes. I could come up with multiple similar quotes for the ECB, but I will not. So one was 2001. So BOJ became independent, and then 2001, governor, according to press, ruled out the implementation of additional monetary easing measure as the BOJ wants to see how economic structural progress under the administration of Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. Or Shirakawa's description of the dominant view, I understand, in the BOJ. This is a quote. Further easing would not contribute to economic recovery, but would rather delay the progress of structural reform that is a prerequisite for sustainable economic growth. So you have examples, and the ECB have been doing this as well, then governments are not implementing what, in the view of the central bank, is best structural reforms, so they don't implement the correct monetary policy in order to give incentives to the central bank to do this. I'd like your views on how this lines up with how we should be thinking about central bank independence and its governance.
Thank you very much, Athanasios. Any other comments? Please.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Ms. Nessen, which is more related to financial stability than to monetary policy. But if I remember correctly, I saw some articles in newspaper about the possible Swedish migration to banking union, and I find it very interesting intellectually to consider the implication about Sweden moving to joining banking union without integrating its currency to euro. So I'd appreciate it very much if you would share your idea on this. Thank you.
If you can, right? Because, thank you very much. Any other questions? Also with the people on the back tables. I mean, I've never had a chance to speak, but yes, please. If you can come next to the mic, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the conversation.
Tell us who you are.
Yeah, sorry, I'm Stanislas Jordan. I work at Positive Money, an NGO working on those issues. What I really liked about it, the last intervention was, I think, the best synthesis, because it was clearly drawing a sort of difference between the concept of separation of power and the actual then sort of more kind of economic policies the central bank should take. And this is really interlinked, but I think sometimes, I mean, very often I've seen these debates and we end up having a very passionate and we don't understand each other, because I would say we should do helicopter money, and some other people would say that's against the independence. But I'm not against the independence. I defend the separation of power. So I think it's really interesting to distinguish those two issues, central bank independence, and I think if we look into it, most people defend it. There's no real threat on the separation of power. I think everyone agrees on that. We understand that money is such a big power that it has to be protected. But then it comes to the second part, so my question would be, can we, it's a very open question, sorry, it's not very specific, but can we sort of redesign monetary financing on these sort of ideas while protecting central bank independence? I think that was also at the heart of what was being discussed with Eric. I think this is the key matter. We need new economic policies by central bank while protecting central bank independence. So, very difficult
Very
one.
much. I think that's a good summary of the conflicts that we are facing. Any other questions before I return to our panelists? Perhaps we can go in reverse order if you don't mind. Professor Taha, actually, difficult questions.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. It's a very difficult question that I think that Professor, it's a very, and actually that I'd like to mention about it, a more recent problem of that because Abenomics and January 2013, in 2013 that Bank of Japan adopted 2% inflation targeting. This is not under the Governor Kuroda. This is under the Governor Shirakawa. You know? And so I think my personal observation that it is under the pressure of the political Prime Minister Abe. So Bank of Japan had a lot of the condition. So we adopting that 2% inflation targeting. If government conduct the structural reform policy which can achieve that increase the potential growth rate, as I mentioned, that the 2% target. So this is a conflict between politics and the central bank. And so this is a good kind of the tension between the central bank and the government. But my personal opinion, after the Kuroda-san took the chair of the governor, he didn't mention anything about that. Even that the last September, we had a report of the review of the 2% inflation targeting. This report didn't mention anything about that. Okay? And the last 4 years, as I mentioned, BOJ allowed to fiscal expansion. Okay. And now government debt increase. If this increase in debt has a contribution of increasing the potential growth, it's okay. But nothing happened. It's already low, staying low in like a 0.3 or 0.5. So that's the situation. I said that, and maybe that this is not the correct answer to that, but we need a kind of, so even within the government, central bank has its own rule, like a judicial court, you know, or ICC. We need independence and that kind of the political game. Even so that, I mean that the central bank is a political player, more neutral. And that's my opinion. So you don't satisfy, but that's my opinion. That I finished.
The last word.
Okay, thank you. All right. First, the easy question. Your question about how did we go about making decisions in an uncertain environment? And I think there was a large element of learning by doing. And what I'm thinking of more specifically now was when in 2015, the Swedish central bank followed in the footsteps of some other central banks and went into negative territory. And there was definitely one small step, then have a look, what were the effects, any unintended consequences, any negative consequences, and etc. So we proceeded in that way. So now we're at minus 0.5, and that's been in 4 steps, I think. Same applies for our QE purchases. In contrast to, for example, what the Fed has done, I mean, they've announced programs that were very, very, a plan for the future. They would be buying a certain amount per month, and until they said stop. No, that's not what the Central Bank of Sweden did. Instead, on about 5 or 6 different occasions, they've announced that we are going to buy X billion worth of Swedish government bonds during this time period. What happens after that? We'll see. So, and that's been repeated a couple of times. And so that's our QE program. So that's one way of handling uncertainty, is going one step at a time. I could talk more about uncertainty, but it's very late in the afternoon. Let me just quickly respond to these questions about on the banking union. I have to refrain from answering. That is not my area of expertise. E-money, should we allow individuals to have accounts directly with the central bank? I forget who posed the question. Was it? Yes. That is interesting question, and that's under review. So we just started last year. The Riksbank started a project. We call it the e-krona project, and we're studying the many aspects of the idea of launching a central bank-backed electronic currency. We're looking at many aspects to that: operational, etc., monetary policy, financial stability, payments, etc. We're looking at that one issue at a time. This is one of the questions that we're looking at. I have no answer. And then your other question, Athanasios, on how to think about the democratic control of a central bank. I think that's the question, and all I can say that there is no one size fits all, and it varies over time. It'll be different in different countries, in different contexts. And the historic pendulum has perhaps swung a little bit now, since central banks have been doing things which are deemed to be more outside their remit, and maybe there is, so there are calls for more democratic, I wouldn't call it control, but more interaction with the central bank. And I think that's one way of going forward. More dialogue, more interaction with the public at large and with the politicians.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I think that was a great point to finish this discussion today. And thank you. Also thank the Graduate School of Economics at the Kobe University who made this possible, bringing and discussing what is, in my view, one of the most important issues in future economic policy. Thank you for coming all the way and for helping us organize this, and I hope we can continue the conversation in months to come. Thank you for coming on. Join me in thanking the panel.